Mr. Little Granger, do you want to start speaking?
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Edward, and I'm very grateful to have a chance to bring up a question that is incredibly important. I'm also very thankful for the Minister allowing me to go on slightly longer, and I know that he has allowed me to talk at some length on this issue, as I think it is incredibly important. I would say, Sir Edward, that there are some very sensitive questions about the most senior policeman in my neck of the woods and the matter of his appointment which deserves putting before members. I would never bring such matters to the Chamber if they were not of genuine public concern. May I say on the outset, I haven't had the opportunity to meet our new Chief Constable, Mr. Andy Marsh. And since he is the subject of fresh investigations to alleged misconduct, to which I will be referring, he may prefer to keep it that way for the time being. But I will, Sir Edward, confess that I am worried. Significantly worried to have twice intervened in the chamber of this House during business questions, and also the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who actually did approach me independently, as the Minister is aware. Then, mysteriously, a few days ago, believe it or not, I received a letter from the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner, both complaining about my parliamentary involvement in reporting to the Standards Board for doing my job. A new twist. They want me to apologise and retract what I said in the House. Was this a cack-handed attempt to intimidate me? I hope not. That is not their role, and it's certainly not mine. And I'm sure they'd much rather I shut up and leave them alone, but this is something I cannot do, will not do, and I don't believe should do. The integrity of the police service is vital. The public rightly expects the very highest standards of probity from all serving officers. And I am doing my job in making sure that is upheld. What worries me is how and why this appointment of the Chief Constable was made in the first place. In order to answer these questions, I'm afraid it is necessary to return to some dreadful events that took place at a specialist residential school for children with learning difficulties a few years ago. Sir Edward, if you'll bear with me. The school was near Southampton, and Mr. Andy Marsh was the Deputy Chief Constable of Hampshire at the time. He's also launched an investigation into claims of sexual abuse. Shocking allegations were made by some former pupils. Stories of grooming, rape of vulnerable children emerged. Something rotten seems to have taken place at the Stanbridge Earls School. But in spite of investigation by the local authority, Ofsted and the police, nobody was ever prosecuted. That was back in 2011. 2 years later, this story hadn't gone away. In fact, the number of allegations has increased, and there were questions about how thoroughly the police looked into it. By now, Mr. Marsh had been promoted. He was Hampshire's Chief Constable, and on his watch, Operation Farnborough was launched to try and get to the bottom of it. Had he done a proper job? Were there grounds for disciplinary action against any officers? The investigation lasted 8 months with inquiries in 10 different countries. More than 1,200 documents containing 20,000 pages were reviewed. 79 witness statements were taken, 172 officers' reports were submitted. It came to nothing. There was no disciplinary action, there were no prosecutions. Mr. Marsh at that time was also himself under scrutiny. The rules for complaint against Chief Constables are different. The Commissioner can deal with it internally, or, if it's considered a serious complaint, can call in another police force. Hampshire's Commissioner asked Essex Police to do the digging. There were 9 complaints against Mr. Marsh. Included in these were failure to undertake a thorough investigation into sexual abuse of vulnerable pupils and failure to protect one particular vulnerable child. It took almost a year to complete the inquiry, and on the 10th of June 2014, Essex Police announced they found no grounds to justify any allegations. Mr. Marsh was formally cleared. End of the story. I simply don't know. I'm not the MP for Hampshire, and I can read in private eye and elsewhere as most anyone else. But it's quite clear, because there were so many references on the internet, the allegations went on, and I'm afraid are still being made. No doubt all Chief Constables make enemies from time to time, but this Chief Constable seemed to have attracted some very determined foes. I find it hard to understand why none of this seems to have rung any alarm bells whatsoever in the office of the Police and Crime Commissioner for Avon and Somerset when she hired him. The she in question, of course, is Mrs. Sue Mount-Stevens. And I think it might be helpful for this House and for the record to supply a little bit of background information on her. She used to be a big wheel in the fast food running of one of Bristol's best-known family bakeries. Mount-Stevens made their name churning out pasties. When Mrs. Mount-Stevens inherited the business, she must have changed the recipe. The customers stopped coming, the shop shut, 300 staff lost their job, and the century of tradition went down the pan, probably along with the pasties. However, Mrs. Mount-Stevens wasn't going to let a business disaster stand in her way. She joined the old police authority and did, I quote, good works, and found a team of life coaches offering business advice. Here's an example from an interview she gave their indispensable organ of record, the Grocer magazine. I quote, Sir Edward, A great leader is someone who communicates extensively, is prepared to say what she feels when there are tough decisions to be made, and admits when things aren't going too well. Down at the Portishead HQ of the Avon and Somerset Police Force, I suspect they're chuckling about that. Anyway, the miracle of democracy, the Pasty Queen as she's known in Bristol, has held the job of Police Crime Commissioner since 2012. A dismally small number of people, 14% of the electorate, bothered the first time round, and this time only 26% bothered to cross the ballot paper. Of course, we all know that the electoral system for police and crime commissioners is about as thick and indigestible as the crust on a Mount Stevens pasty. But the end result is that very few police commissioners are in their job with genuine widespread public support. Certainly not in the case of Mrs. Mount Stevens. On her very first day of the job, she told the old Chief Constable his services were no longer required. Goodbye. Colin Port was gobsmacked. He was the Chief Constable. I would like to believe that she fired him for getting the police saddled with South West on a joint venture company set up by IBM and 2 Somerset councils. It was an absolute, total disaster, to put it crudely, half-baked. Actually, it wasn't even half-baked, it was never cooked. It cost the taxpayer tens of millions of pounds, saved nothing, and it was a disaster. I actually got to say that South West London lost so much money, all participants eventually bailed out, including Avon and Somerset Police Force. I'm not sure that Mount Stevens sacked Colin Port for any sensible reason. I have a horrible feeling she might have done it out of pique, or because she had a headache, or she just didn't like it. Her management style gives everybody the heebie-jeebs, in particular her dangerous high-speed, hire and fire policy. Avon and Somerset is now on its 3rd Chief Constable in 3 years, and that is not including the deputies. She's had 6 altogether in 4 years. 3 Chief Constables, 3 acting. And whoever stepped in to cover the gaps, I think it's the ultimate poisonous chalice. It's hard to keep up with the actual musical chairs in the Portishead HQ. Hardly was Colin Port out the door than Nick Gargan was pushed in. The rules say she has the right to clunk them in or replace them. This she did. Mr. Gargan was a totally different animal. Much more of a modernising, fast-track copper, young, clever, and believe it or not, with a love of opera. The old guard probably thought, hello, he's not one of us, but he was the first choice of the Pasty Queen, possibly because he was the only serious candidate. There's an increasing problem. Chief Constables don't seem to be falling over themselves to apply for the top jobs. Perhaps they think the pay isn't worthwhile or the responsibility is too onerous. Perhaps they won't apply because they can't be certain of success anymore. Or perhaps they don't fancy working alongside particular police commissioners. Now, that's a thought. Last year, the Chief Police Authority, Last year, the Chief Police Officers Staff Association did a survey of 25 forces. There were 5 Chief Constable vacancies, which only attracted 11 applications. Two of the vacancies had a single candidate each. Not so much a recruitment process as, I would say to the Minister, a cosy shoe-in. And I know he doesn't like that any more than I do. I'm afraid this is something the Home Affairs Committee has already highlighted, and it's a problem that I know the Minister will probably want to address when he replies. Anyway, back to Nick Gargan. He'd been running the National Police Recruitment Agency after a stint at number 2 at Thames Valley. He'd never applied to be Chief Constable before, but Mrs. Mount Stevens railed him in. Gargan was hired to make changes. He favoured the direct entry scheme to allow non-office staff to take up jobs at inspector or inspector level, skipping the lower ranks. This was in line with the Home Office thinking, but the Police Federation called it half-baked. Honestly, I'm not inventing these baking references. I actually did say that. Nick Gargan was well thought of by officers, as far as I'm aware, but higher up the ladder there were people out to get him. He served a mere 14 months when allegations of inappropriate behaviour began to emerge. It came the PCC to investigate. The chief was suspended. Nobody gave any formal evidence against him. This was more of a whispering campaign. The investigation went on for a year, and the verdict was that he showed flawed judgment. Hardly a sacking offence. If he did that to MPs, it wouldn't be any of us. By then, however, Mrs. Mount Stevens was getting twitchy. She set up a fresh inquiry. It took ages to decide Mr. Gargan was not guilty of any gross misconduct at all. He was rapped over the knuckles with 8 written warnings and recommended to turn to work. I don't think Mrs. Mount Stevens had a clue. She isn't bright. She's, in fact, incredibly thick. She didn't know how to react. She dithered, and the lynch mob got busy, not edifying in the police. The Chief Superintendents Association asked its members what they thought, and 24 out of 25 said they'd lost confidence in Mr. Gargan. This provided Mrs. Mount Stevens, unexpectedly, with the ammunition she needed. Funny that. Could it have been deliberately orchestrated? Perish the thought. After all, it's very unusual indeed, unprecedented in my experience, for a group of top officers to gang up in public and stab their chief in the back. The whole thing appears to have been arranged by Chief Superintendent Ian Wiley, who happens to be her head of the Standards, Culture, Ethics Department of the Avon Somerset Constabulary. I don't know, they're coming to get me. I don't know what the ethical standards are being used when this letter, Mrs. Mount Stevens, damning the Chief Constables, leaked. But I could hazard a guess. Wiley by name, Wiley by nature. This is dirty tricks at its lowest level. And there was more. Out of the woodwork came 3 former Chief Constables, all parroting exactly the same criticism of the Chief Constable. Dave Shattuck, Steve Pilkington, and Colin Port, Sir Edward, who I'd already mentioned, wrote to Mrs. Mount Stevens and said they thought it was impossible for Nick Gargan to return to work. The dithering baker was forced into a corner, not surprisingly. In desperation, she asked Tom Windsor, the Chief Inspector of Constabulary, what he thought. Surprise, surprise. Sir Thomas looked at all the letters and concluded that Gargan had lost the confidence of his staff. Nick Gargan is no fool. There was now more mud flying than Glastonbury, and it was all being chucked away. He did quit. But what a dismal, appalling way to run a police force. Backstabbing, innuendos, and downright dishonesty. Now let's come back to Andy Marsh. Just before Christmas last year, Mr. Marsh got Mr. Gargan's job. There were only 2 candidates, Mr. Marsh himself, the Assistant Chief, and the Assistant Chief Constable, Gareth Morgan, who had actually been holding the fort at Edward since Nick Gargan left. Remember, Mr. Marsh had already been a Chief Constable over at Hampshire, but has always had a soft spot for Avon and Somerset, where he started as a recruit. That's where he met his wife, Nikki. Sorry, I should have paraphrased that, Sir Edward, to say that Mrs. Marsh is also a senior member of the Avon and Somerset Police Force. Believe it or not, she's one of the Assistant Chief Constables, and she uses her maiden name, Nikki Watson. Funny enough, if you look on the Avon and Somerset website, it says Andy Marsh is married with 2 daughters and enjoys fly fishing, running and rowing. Down below it says Nicky Morgan is married with 2 daughters. Doesn't actually put the 2 together. She was there when he came back. This is an unusual situation. It may be unique, but in no way can it be called ideal. Mrs. Marsh will have to report to another Deputy Chief Constable in order to avoid conflicts of interest. Once again, the pasty queen has bent over backwards to get the man she wanted, but has she bent too far? Andy Marsh took up his new job in February. 3 months later, he was back in the headlines because of another complaint against him. Mrs. Mount Stevens said she received a new complaint relating to Andy Marsh's role, investigating those allegations of rape at Stanbridge Girls' School in Hampshire. Her instincts were clear it up quietly with Mr. Marsh himself, but the complaint appealed. And here we are again. The pasty queen has called in another police force to look over this again. Remember, last time it took a year to clear Mr. Marsh's name. I'm not happy with this situation. It is obvious that the accusations were like to follow Mr. Marsh. They may be vexatious, they may be all legitimate. This is for the new inquiry to determine. But while they hang in the air, this does absolutely no good for the reputation or the morale of the Avon and Somerset Police Force. The Police and Crime Commission deserves to take the blame for another expensive fiasco and mistake. According to the Taxpayers' Alliance, the comparative cost of running her office and the old police authority has risen by a fifth. It is not surprising. She employs 19 people. How do you employ 19 people as a police and crime commissioner? What are they all doing? Stabbing the chief constable in the back? I noticed that my honourable friend's department is giving commissioners, including Mrs. Mount Stevens, the new powers to oversee the Fire and Rescue Service. I would beg him not to do it, especially in Avon and Somerset. The Fire Brigade Union actually called it, and I quote, a half-baked idea. I don't know where this is all coming from. Mrs. Mount Stevens is no berry. I'm not convinced she could be trusted to run a police canteen. But the point here is quite simple, Sir Edward. The police chief constable, Sir Andy Marsh, Mr. Andy Marsh, should be suspended, like she's done with all the others, until this is cleared up. These are not trivial fly-by-night allegations. These are serious allegations. You cannot pretend they haven't been made. You cannot pretend they are not current. Why he's still there is beyond me. I think one of the reasons is because if he goes, it's his missus that takes over. That could make the breakfast table quite interesting in the Marsh household. And I suspect also that Mrs. Mount Stevens has once again lost her nerve. She doesn't know what to do. Like I said, she isn't bright. I'm being generous. We do need to have clear understanding of the role of the police commissioner the role of the Chief Constable. In Avon and Somerset, they are blurred. Avon and Somerset is becoming a police farce, not a police force. I would urge the Minister, I know there are limitations on what he can say, I understand that. I quite agree with that, because there is an ongoing investigation. But I know the Minister has heard my words, and I am grateful that you said you will meet me and talk to me about this. We do need to come to an understanding of the role in the future of these people. Because unless we do, I strongly believe people in my constituency across the Avon and Somerset police force will lose their faith in the police. They need faith in the police, they need trust in the police. The coppers on the ground are damn good, they do a good job. The role of policemen has not changed in 100 years. They are still vital to law and order, safekeeping of people, and the looking after of the well-being of my other constituencies in Somerset and Avon. But this is a mockery of all. I would ask the Minister, please, give my thoughts a fair wind and see what we can do to change the situation. Sir Edward, thank you very much.
Minister.
So Edward, good morning, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I normally say at this stage, thank my honourable friend for bringing a debate to the chamber here this morning. And he's right and proper that he has done so. However, as he has alluded to in his comments, I am enormously restricted in what I can say. And he in his speech, he went quite far-ranging. I am here really to talk about the Chief Constable at Avon and Somerset police force, which is obviously where we are. But I will touch on some of the points that he has made. PCCs, whether they had a 1% turnout or 100% turnout, are electable. The public have the right to decide whether they want to vote for them, for someone else, or not vote at all. And naturally, in the early days, people really didn't know what they were voting for. The turnout has substantially gone up, and actually substantially gone up as well, where the PCC election was alongside, say, for instance, local government elections. And of course, at the next election for PCCs, it should, but nothing's perfect in this place, so we don't really know, it should be concurrent with a general election, Sir Edward. However, who knows with the events taking place around us as we speak. But I hope it is. I hope that this Parliament stays for it. And of course, then indeed the turnout will be completely different. But what we have done is put place powers with an elected person responsible for their community, with not powers over the operational policing, but the administration. And it's for them to decide how much they spend, and then the public can see exactly. So it's not opaque, it's very open. The reason that my honourable friend was able to comment the way he has about how much staff there, how much is being spent, is frankly because that is open. No. And he's absolutely right to say that there is an ongoing inquiry. There is a process in place for that, and it's not for a policing minister to in any way interfere or influence that. They are very serious allegations, and I think it's very important that they are investigated fully. And I also feel, and I saw some of the commentary around my honourable friend's previous comments in the Ford House, this place has privilege. It is for him to decide the language and what he says in his speeches, so that we have the freedom to represent our constituents in the way that we feel that should be done. However, the ongoing investigation does mean that there is uncertainty, and I fully accept my honourable friend's concerns, and I also fully accept that, like in the other 43 forces that I'm responsible for, the boys and girls on the beat do a simply fantastic job on a day-in, day-out basis, basis. And it is, as he alluded to in his comments, deeply unsettling that you have a force which has had so many chief constables over a short period of time. Sometimes there are really good reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into whether the reasons were right or wrong. That is very much for the PCC and for the local community. However, I know what it was like when we both served in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, that if you don't know who your colonel is from one day to the next, it is really difficult to get that kind of feeling of unity down through the system. However, also in the comments, the numbers of chief constables people applying for chief constables jobs is difficult, and I've got as I'm sure my friend in South Yorkshire, which is going through a really difficult time at the moment, is also advertising for a new Chief Constable in that place. It is an enormously onerous task to be Chief Constable of a force. I think in many parts of the country, Sir Edward, there are, the political skills of a Chief Constable and the management skills are as important, frankly, as the understanding of the day-to-day policing side of it, because of the way that they have to deal with it. So it's not a task, interestingly enough, that I would want to have taken on. But we have opened it up, and the direct entry scheme, and there are people that are for it and there are people against it, will open opportunities up for people to come through the ranks. In so many parts of the police force, it's, the old saying when we was in the army was dead man's shoes. But that can't happen. We need to make sure that we have people that could have aspiration and dreams of being Chief Constables, and that's what they want to do. They may want to do other specialist areas, but I think it is absolutely crucial that we do that. In the bill that is left this House, Sir Edward, which is due to be second read in the other place fairly soon, we have given powers for PCCs to ask the Home Secretary and put a business plan forward to take on the administration side of the fire service. I have to declare an interest, Sir Edward. I wrote a paper on this some 30 years ago, saying that the emergency services must work closer together. And I think there's no argument about that. It was just whether or not, and we had this debate on committee in particular, whether or not that should be a councillor seconded onto a committee and then paid a bit of extra money, or it should be someone who is directly elected. I freely admit that one size won't fit all, and if an agreement cannot be reached locally, and a PCC or a Metro Mayor wants to put forward a business plan to the Home Secretary, naturally enough the Home Secretary and the Police and Fire Minister, because I am the first ever Police and Fire Minister, would look at that, but one size truly won't fit all. I think, of course I give it.
Just for clarification, can I just use the Avon and Somerset Force area as an example? Our fire brigade, as you're well aware, comes under the Devon and Somerset Fire Brigade. We have one mayor, which at the moment is in Bristol. Yes. The rest of Somerset is not covered. If that was the case, and the Metropolitan Mayor of Bristol put forward a case to take over the fire brigade, given that we are a slightly skewed thing, that obviously has merit because of devolution. And the Minister is well aware what we're trying to do with devolution in both Somerset and Devon. And we're trying to look at joining perhaps closer together. But that doesn't include Bristol or what we call North Somerset, which is basically my honourable friends for Western, for North East Somerset and for the other bit of Bristol. How would that work? Because that's actually of quite interest, I think.
Sir Edward, if I could just, as I say, when I said a moment ago the one size fits all, this is a classic example. So in certain parts of the country, it's a very simple procedure. So you have a fire authority and a police authority, as it was now under the PCC, and they mesh very close. Now, it would be I'd have a very simple job of looking at all the business plans and coming to some conclusions, if that's the way it was around the country, and of course it's not. And amalgamations, for instance, of fire services were taking place right up until this was being transferred from DCLG into my portfolio. I think it's best not to just use Avon and Somerset as a straight on, but to look at some of the other models which are being talked about, even though I freely admit I do not have the business plans on my desk. No. So in some parts of the country I've been approached by chief fire officers to say, well, our fire brigade is too small. We do not want to be regionalised, and we've seen some of the problems that have been occurred with the ambulance service being regionalised. We don't want to be regionalised, but we would be a better administrative, functional body if we were a larger fire service. Does that prevent us from then being of a Metro Mayor takeover? Because there's a little bit of, well, if we grow in size, perhaps that would prevent us being amalgamated with the police. I've got other areas where, at the moment, they're looking at whether or not they could take on the emergency service of the ambulance service, as well as the fire and the police. Because obviously the ambulance service is commissioned by the CCGs. It's not actually money that comes directly onto them from central government. And I've got other areas, and I suppose Merseyside will be probably one of the obvious ones as we look towards the Metro Mayors going forward, where their boundary it slightly goes into Cheshire, for instance. And what we've said all the way along is that is not a game stopper. That would not be able to stop it, and we would have to work across government to come to sensible conclusions about what is the best way to deliver the services and emergency services where we need. So there is a simple answer to what my honourable friend says. What we've said during the course of the bill is that it's absolutely vital that we don't look at silos, we don't look at buildings. Using the analogy of a church, Sir Edward, a church is a group of people, not necessarily a building, people coming together. We always look at churches as buildings. The fire service love to look at fire stations and headquarters and the police service. And what I've been pushing very hard, for instance, as we move from a really difficult austerity situation, that we continue to look carefully at how we spend the capital assets, which are very extensive within the police and the fire around the country, and even Somerset is not different to that, as to saying, well, okay, if we are going to have a different kind of type of police in an area, why is the police station in that community probably not based in the local fire station? Because it's quite difficult to actually put a fire appliance inside a police station because they don't fit in the foyer so well when it's a 10-ton truck. But it's very easy to do it the other way around, and we've seen that in Hampshire and in Lincolnshire and other parts of the country. So to answer a very long answer to a very, very simple intervention is we rule nothing out, and we have a very open mind. Now, we would prefer, under devolution and localism, to have that agreed locally, but we're pragmatic enough to realise within the department that that isn't going to happen every time. And if that isn't going to happen every time, then sometimes difficult decisions would have to be made by the Home Secretary with some advice from myself. On the specific points to do with the future and the investigations of the Chief Constable, that is something which, frankly, is not in my remit, and rightly so. We don't live in that sort of society, thank goodness. And the PCC was duly elected. There is a mechanism, should my honourable friend feel that the PCC is not doing a job correctly, has brought the force industry. There are mechanisms in place. PCCs are not exempt from disciplinary action either, but that mechanism clearly has not been triggered yet. But I also, and there's nothing to do with me as to whether what is or isn't, but I think one thing which, to me as a parliamentarian, Sir Edward, is very important, that even though I'm not skillful enough to have used some of the language and links to the bakery industry that my honourable friend has used today, it is very important that colleagues across the House can have the confidence that they can express their concerns on behalf of the public without the concern that they would lose the privilege. Privilege is really, really important. So many times in this House I've heard people say to me, if I wasn't a Member of Parliament, if I wasn't in this chamber, I wouldn't be allowed to say that, even though I passionately believe it's true, mostly because I probably couldn't prove it in law or in fact. That principle is something that keeps this democracy sound. So I do congratulate the Honourable Gentleman to continue to express his concerns. There is a process in place. It is clearly not for the Police and Fire Minister to interfere with that. But I do stress I would think it would be useful. It might be a very difficult meeting. I think it would be sensible to take up the offer from the PCC to meet with her and to meet with the Chief Constable, because at the end of the day, they are the people responsible for the well-being in my humble friend's constituency. Thank you, Sir.
Order. Order. Suspended till 2:30.